Hello, this is my case study presentation for Module 9. We begin by looking at our facts. We start with Mr. Inman, was a first-year assistant principal at Rocket Junior High. He has a passion for students who come from the South Side, just like he did, and he cultivated a relationship with his students and advocated for those students. We have two students involved in this case study. Our first one on the right is James. He's a 15-year-old muscular, heavily tattooed leader of his group. He is also from the South Side, but he's improved his grades, mingled with others, and not been involved in a fight for months. He exchanged brass knuckles with David in this case study. Our second individual is David. He is slightly built young scholar, honor student, standout trombonist and band, and has no behavioral record. Another player that takes place in this case study is the actual policy itself. It states that the possession of brass knuckles, a prohibited weapon, constitutes a felony offense. This is enforced by the school officer and by the Director of Secondary Education. And if anyone is in possession of these items, it is a required expulsion. We also know that this happens on a spring day around 5th period, happens in the school hallway. And what happened, just a brief synopsis, is that James's 5th period teacher witnessed him giving something to David. The teacher believes that drugs were being exchanged. Both boys were then called to Mr. Inman's office and they were questioned by Richard Inman. During this, Mr. David here began shaking when being questioned, tears in his eyes, refused to speak, and the officer then went to kind of pat down David and found the brass knuckles. James spoke up and said the brass knuckles were his. The school officer immediately handcuffed David. Mr. Inman asked for the handcuffs to be removed, knowing that he was now innocent, but the officer refused to do that and took both boys to jail. After this happened, Mr. Inman called both mothers, and James's mother basically said, let him sit it out in jail, hoping he'll learn this time, suggesting that this has happened multiple times before. David's mother became very angry, showed up to school in 15 minutes, and wanted to know why her son was being put in jail when her son was innocent. The legal issues with this case is that Mr. Inman is being harmed in multiple ways. He's possibly losing the relationships that he has cultivated with his students and with the director, and he may require or may receive an official reprimand if he does not follow the policy. If he chooses to follow the policy, then he is not going against the law and he's not breaching contract. But if he follows his own ethics and his own moral dilemma and his own feelings of ethics, then he will not be doing either one of these. Mr. James is being harmed because he is guilty and admitted to that, and so he will be sent to the district AEP. He did go against the law and he did breach the contract or the policies of the school, and he also constituted harassment towards David. David is being harmed by emotional distress and possibly being placed in the district DAP, and his reputation and his academic file can also be in jeopardy. The other characters here we have is David's mother. Her relationship with this trust with the school is being compromised, not putting faith in them taking care of the innocents, and the emotional distress that she's also going through. The final one is the director here. If he is possibly going harassment, if he is not listening to Mr. Inman's side and maybe kind of bullying or pushing him to follow the policy. We don't know enough about that to know if he really is falling into that category or not. James's unethical decision created a ripple effect for several others the moment he chose to pass off his weapon to another student. May even be considered that it started when he decided he needed to take care of some personal school business after school. Looking at these individuals again, this is giving you more of the same information, but we're just kind of looking a little bit more detailed. We start with Mr. Inman in the center. He's a first-year assistant principal from the south side of town, and his agenda is always to advocate for students from south side, which also bothers him because he did not initially advocate for David with the officer and being sent to jail. And so that is also weighing on him and whether or not he's following, his ethics. We have Mr. James is the next character. He's a 15-year-old leader of the South Side group. He's considered a bully amongst the school leaders. He has improved his grade and his social conduct. He did pass off the brass knuckles to David and takes ownership of his actions, which is a positive for Mr. James. Then we have Mr. David over here. He's a young honor student, no behavioral record whatsoever, part of the exchange with James, and scared when he's asked about the events. Then we have our school officer. He searched David during the meeting in the office, and he also handcuffed David when the weapon was found. He is following the school policy, nothing more at that point. Then we have the mothers that come in. James's mother was quoted to say, we talked about earlier, let him sit there for a few days. Maybe he will learn his lessons at that time. So it gives you an idea of her emotional state at the moment. And then we have David's mother, different view. If the other kid admitted he forced my son to do this, why is my son in trouble? And she's very angry. Then we end with the director of secondary education, who also is following the policy, and he gives Richard two options: one, to follow the policy, or to receive official reprimand if he chooses not to. The place or the location of this case study happens in Rocket Junior High, which has 900 students. The South Side students are perceived as those to be more struggling with behavior. That's why Mr. Inman reaches out to them. The event takes place in the hallway around fifth period. The discussion and action happened in the office, Mr. Inman's office to be exact. It's where the conversation with the students happened. It's where the students were handcuffed and then taken to jail. And it's also where Mr. Inman called the mothers, and then David's mother came and met with Mr. Inman. Then we also have the DAP is mentioned several times, which is the district's disciplinary alternative education program. The policy states that they should be there for minimum of 45 days, and that's where James is sent, and David will follow if the policy is withheld or continued, and followed. The program, it's a public school, middle school. This is dealing with behavioral case, not academics here, and we're looking maybe at a diverse economical background of culture of the students, considering we're talking about South Side students compared to other students in the area. Could the conflict or the situation be damaging to stakeholders or the community? It could be to both the students, James and David, as well as Mr. Inman. What individuals or groups have an important stake in the outcome? James is being sent to the detention center. David may be punished even though he is innocent. And Mr. Inman may be reprimanded permanently in his file if he makes the ethical choice and not follows the policy. Have all the relevant stakeholders been consulted? I don't think so as of yet. I would address the school board, other administrations, take a look at the policies, and see if there's something else that could be done. What else can we learn about the situation? Again, I'd look at the actual policy. I would talk to a legal professional, seek advice from other teachers or other administrators. Maybe they have gone through something similar and can give you advice. Do we have enough to make the decision? I don't think so. I would, after speaking with the colleagues, getting more advice from legal counsels, then I would be able to make a better final decision as to how to handle the situation at this time. The possible options are to follow the policy. If they do choose to do that, James and David would both be in DAP for a minimum of 45 days, according to the policy. And Mr. Inman would not be reprimanded, but he would feel guilty and it would be going against his ethics. The second choice is to not follow the policy. That would still put James in the DAEP for a minimum of 45 days since he was found guilty, but it would put David back in the class. It would also give Mr. Inman an official reprimand in his file, but he would know he was following his moral ethics and feel better about that and advocating for David. Some other intermediate strategies would be one, to seek that legal advice that may be able to keep David in class and keep Mr. Inman from having that reprimand and be allowing him to model that ethical behavior for others. Another option might be to look at changing the policy. This would keep David in class. Mr. Inman would still not be reprimanded, and it would allow him to model ethical behavior. And the policy would also be improved for future students and make a change in the wording and help others. The pros and cons to each one of these, I'm going to move me a little bit here so you can see this a little better. Sorry about that. By following the policies, the pros would be James receives his consequence and Mr. Inman is not reprimanded. The cons would be David is punished while being innocent and Mr. Inman would still be going against his moral compass and no policies would be changed. If they choose to not follow the policy, James still receives his consequence, David's back in class, but the con is Mr. Inman receives the official reprimand and the policy is still not changed. If they seek legal advice, pros would be James still receives his consequence, David's back in class, Mr. Inman does not get reprimanded, but the policy is still not changed. If we can get the policy to change, then we have nothing but pros. James receives the consequence, David's back in class, Mr. Inman does not get reprimanded, and the policy is changed, which will help others in the future. Then, moving back over, sorry. The best decision that I see based on what I see within this case and my own experience is I have to follow what I know is morally right. That's what I teach my students. Being a Christian school is to always go with what God wants you to do, and God does not want you to punish the innocent. So I would go with the intermediate strategy, changing the policy, which gives James the consequence. It lets David back in class, Mr. Inman's not reprimanded, and he gets to change the policy. In order to do that, we have a step-by-step process. First of all, don't sign the paper. Speak with administration, see if you can change their mind, see if there's anything else you can do and what would you do to go change the policy. That's your next step, and go through all the processes that require for that. And the last is to cultivate those relationships, rebuild those relationships back up with the students and with the parents and the administration. This would be my best ideal decision. But if this does not work, if you're not allowed to make policy changes or get that started, then I would go with don't follow the policy. Yes, that means Mr. Inman would receive the official reprimand, but I would rather my conscience be clear and going against what I know is right and handle a mark on me if this were my decision. That may still follow you, but maybe future administration you could explain and it wouldn't be as dramatic. The steps to follow that would be very similar to the previous decision. The only difference is instead of making policy change, you would have to accept the reprimand and whatever consequences that would follow. So these are the my case study and my plans, and as a teacher going through all of these decisions, I would always still stand firm to going what is right for the students and all involved. And I think these last two options are the best for the students because that's what we're here for, is to help those students.